When working with either typography or layout, it is crucially important that you understand the different units of measurement that CSS allows you to use, and when you would use one over the other. When you discuss units of measurement in CSS, there are two general categories: absolute and relative. Absolute, which can also be referred to as fixed units, delineate a fixed size, one that does not change based on any other factors. Relative units of measurement look for either a parent element or the user agent itself for a base value to begin with. With those two categories in mind, let's take a look at the options available to you when specifying sizes in your styles. So here we have measurement.html opened up, and we're just going to go through a couple of these units of measurement. Let's talk about points first. Now, points are units of measurement that are designed for print. They are, in fact, 1/72nd of an inch. So, what does that translate to on the screen? Well, that's a very good question. You need to know the resolution the monitor is set to, as well as the operating system to answer that one. Avoid using points for on-screen font measurement and restrict its use to print style sheets where it belongs. Now, what about inches and centimeters? Well, again, they're just what you think they are. They're useful for other media types, but really probably shouldn't be used for on-screen media. Well, let's move on and talk about relative units of measurement. What about ems? Well, ems are hands down the most popular relative measurement for on-screen sizing. An em is best described as being the equivalent of the size of a capital M for that particular font. An x is equal to the x height of that specific font. The size of the font can change dramatically as font families are substituted, so it should be used with care. Now, percentages values are pretty straightforward. A percent value sizes the text to the percentage of its inherited or default value. Now, pixels, they're based on the current resolution of the viewing device. Because it relies on the resolution of the user agent, pixels are sometimes referred to as a relative unit. Now, in truth, setting units to pixels fixes them at that size. There are several reasons to avoid using pixels for font measurement. Internet Explorer, prior to version 7, did not allow the on-screen resizing of pixel-based font sizing. So users of earlier versions of Internet Explorer will not be able to change their font size based on their own viewing preferences if you use pixels. Also, pixel sizes that might look good on a monitor might be far too large for the mobile environment. Pixel-based font sizes don't scale too well between environments. It's best to avoid using pixels for font sizing when possible. Now, most browsers do start with the default font size, and for the majority of browsers, that default font size is 16 pixels. We're going to do a really quick exercise where we take advantage of a browser's default font size and compare a relative unit of measurement with a fixed unit of measurement. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of this page, and I can see that I have one paragraph that says, make this paragraph 16 pixels tall. And then there's another paragraph right below that that says, make this one 16 pixels tall too, please. Now, both of these are paragraphs that have classes applied to them. You'll notice that the first paragraph says p.resize, and the second one is p.resize2. So we have classes resize and resize2. Okay. I'm going to go over to my CSS styles panel, and I'm going to scroll down until I find those two selectors, p.resize and p.resize2. The first one, I'm going to go ahead and add a property to that, and I'm going to add the font size property. So font-size. Again, you can get that through the pull-down menu if you'd like. If I hit tab, I get to go over and set a unit of measurement here. So for the first one, I'm going to go ahead and set that to pixels. So I'm just going to type in 16 pixels. Okay, mission accomplished. Hey, nothing really changed here. Okay. Well, I'm going to go down to p.resize2, add a property there, and again, I'm going to do font size. And here, instead of 16 pixels, I'm going to type in 1em. No change. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's preview this in our browser and see if we have any change or if we notice a difference between the pixels, which are on top, and the em, which is on the bottom. So we're going to go ahead and save that and preview that in my browser. And I'm using Firefox, but feel free to use any browser you want with this. Now, if I scroll down, you can see you can't really tell the difference between the two of them. The top one is being sized using pixels. The bottom one is being sized using ems. So you might say, well, okay, so then what's the big deal? Why do we even care which one we're using? Well, The reason that they're both the same size is because my browser is currently set to a default font size of 16 pixels. So the 1M that the second paragraph is doing is sizing to 1 times or 100% of that size, which equates to 16 pixels. Well, let's take a look at what happens if your user changes that within your browser. So I'm going to go up to Tools, and if you're in a different browser, you might find this in a different location. For Firefox, I'm going to go to Tools and choose Options. And if I click on the Content tab, notice that I have a default font and a default size, and sure enough, there it is, set to 16 pixels. Now, if I change that, let's say I go down to, say, 14. If I click OK, notice that now we can see a difference. The font up top that is sized as 16 pixels remains 16 pixels, whereas the one on the bottom changes to reflect the new browser settings. So because it says 14 pixels, now 1M is equal to 14 pixels. So that relative unit of measurement is very handy for users that might have set different preferences for their browsers. They're still going to get everything scaled to the relative size that you need it. So let's say somebody has a vision disorder, goes in their options, and cranks that up to, say, around 18 pixels. Well, they can read your text just fine, whereas if you had set it explicitly at 16 pixels, that would overwrite the browser, and it would force them to look at a size that they don't really want to look at. So as a general rule, M's are the preferred unit of measurement for online type. As always, there are exceptions to this rule. Older versions of Internet Explorer seem to have problems with font size values that are defined strictly as M's. As a workaround, most designers will size the body selector using a percentage value and then define all other measurements in M's. This seems to fix those IE-specific problems. Now, since font size is by and large inherited, meaning if you apply a font size to a parent tag, all the tags inside of it get the same size, it makes sense to carefully plan a sizing strategy for your site. Pick a unit of measurement and take care to stay consistent throughout your site. Using CSS gives you an amazing amount of control over your website's typography, but it doesn't change the fact that we're still restricted to using standard font families. Since HTML does not store font information, your web page relies on the client machine to have the requested font installed. If it's not available, another one is substituted. With CSS, not only can you control which font is initially requested, but which ones should be used for substitution as well. The way this works is that if you only request one font family, if the client machine doesn't have it installed, the browser will then substitute its default font. Since you have no control over what someone has selected as their own default font, a better approach is to declare multiple fonts which will continue to go down the list until an installed font is found. Your final declaration should be a generic font family such as serif or sans serif. That way, in the unlikely event that none of your requested fonts are loaded, at least the text will display in the desired type of font. In CSS terminology, this is what we call a font stack. Let's take a look at how Dreamweaver tackles the process of declaring font stacks and then create our own custom stacks to use within our site. So here we have the mission.html opened up. So one of the things we want to do is take all of the heading ones in our main content region and change that font. Currently, if I click inside this heading, who we are, I can see down in the Properties Inspector that it's being defined as Georgia, Times New Roman, Times, and Serif. Now, it's inheriting that value from the body tag, but what's going to happen is a browser is going to open this page, and this page is first going to say, excuse me, do you have Georgia installed? If the answer is yes, it'll display the font in Georgia. If not, it'll then say, well, what about Times New Roman? What about Times? Or finally, it might say, okay, well, just give me your default serif font if none of those other fonts are available. So we have several fallback fonts here. Okay, we want to use a font that's a little bit less of a standard font. One of the interesting things that's happened over the past few years is that the number of installed fonts that are broadly installed on computers all across the world are increasing. So we are increasingly not limited to just Georgia, Arial, Verdana, Times New Roman. We have a few fonts now that are widely accepted enough to where we can start using them in our font stacks. Now, one of the fonts that I'm going to use here is called Chaparral Pro. And that's a font that's installed with the Creative Suite and widely installed in the machines all across the world. Of course, it's not as widely installed as Georgia or other fonts. So It's one of those fonts where you're going to need to declare within the font stack some common fonts as a fallback for this. So how do we go about declaring a custom font stack? Well, in Dreamweaver, if we grab the pull-down menu for our font here, we can see that Dreamweaver actually comes with a lot of pre-installed stacks. Look at all these. Verdana, Geneva, Sans Serif, Georgia, Courier, Arial. There's a whole list of these things that are predefined. Well, Chaparral's not one of them. So we need to go ahead and add this, but I want to do this in the course of defining something for our heading ones and our main content. Right now, we'd be editing the font stack for the body, and that's not something I want to do. So I'm going to make sure, again, I've clicked inside this heading 1. I'm going to go over to my CSS styles panel, and I'm going to scroll down, not too far, until I find pound main content space H1. Cool. I'm just going to double click on that to bring up my CSS rule definition dialog box. And now I can return to that drop-down menu for the font family, and we'll be affecting the proper selector. Okay, so since I don't see any of these presets that really do what I need it to do, I'm going to go right down here to the last option, which is Edit Font List. Now, this gives me the ability to delete font stacks, add new ones, move font stacks up, move them down the list, that sort of thing, rearrange them. What I want to do is I want to go through the available fonts. So right here are all the fonts installed on my machine. And if I just type in C, that's going to move me down to my Cs. And I'll just keep browsing down until I find Chaparral Pro. There it is. I'm going to hit the right arrow after highlighting it. It's going to add it right there. Now, the first font you add is the first font in the font stack, so you want to do them in order. Now, I'm going to keep scrolling up or down, and I'm going to find Cambria. That's another font that's starting to gain popularity in systems all across the world. And now I need a fallback font that's a little bit more of a standard font. So for this, I'm going to switch down to my G's, and I'm going to find Georgia. Now, there are some systems that don't even have Georgia installed on it, but it's clear from these 3 fonts that I need a serif font. So if I scroll all the way down to the bottom of my available fonts stack, I'm going to find my generic font families right down there. Fantasy might be my favorite. That sounds pretty out there, doesn't it? So I'm just going to go ahead and choose serif and add that to the end of the font stack. So here we have Chaparral Pro, Cambria, Georgia, and serif. I can also move that stack up the list a little bit so that I don't have to scroll as far if I'm going to be using this a lot. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now, when I grab that pull-down menu, it is the very first option. So I'll go ahead and select that, click OK. And when we close that, we notice that both of our headlines are now formatting in the Chaparral font. Now, obviously, I have that installed on my machine, so that was pretty easy to do. But what about fonts that aren't installed on your machine? Well, you won't be able to use that particular tool to do it, but you could still hand code those if you wanted to. So if I scroll down, I see that we have some divs down here, and they have a class called callout. So what if I wanted these headings to be a slightly different font than all of the other headings in my file? I could use that callout H1 selector to do that. So I'm going to use my tag selector to go find that in my source code. Now remember, I can hold my Alt key down. If you're on a Mac, you'll hold your Command and Option key down and click. That brings up the code navigator. And I'm just going to find this main content space dot callout H1. That's the one I want to use. So when I click on that, over here in code view, that should jump me right to that selector. I'm going to create a blank line right after the last line's semicolon. So create a blank line between it and the curly brace. And I'm just going to type in font-family, font-family. Now, if this is your first time hand coding, you'll notice Dreamweaver does something pretty nice for us. As we started typing, it gave us this really nice long list of properties that we could set for our CSS. By continuing to type, that list gets smaller and smaller and smaller till when we get to this point, the only available option is font family. If I hit return, notice that it's going to go ahead and auto-complete that for me, and it's going to complete the syntax of the colon there for me, so I don't really necessarily have to remember to do that. The other thing that it does for me is it starts giving me other pieces of my interface. So you can see here, we have all those predefined font stacks. Well, I want a custom font stack here, so I'm going to do this on my own. What I'm going to do now is in quotation marks, I'm going to type in capital F, Franklin, space, capital G, Gothic, space, medium, all capitalized there, and then close my quotation marks. So why the quotation marks? Well, if your font name includes more than one word, it needs to be encoded in quotation marks. Otherwise, you don't need them. Then I'm going to do a comma, and then Arial, space, narrow, space, bold. Now, spelling and capitalization count here. When your machine looks for this font, it's going to look for a font that is spelled exactly the same way, capitalized exactly the same way. So you want to be really careful with that. Then another comma. Then I'm just going to do Arial, and then another comma, and then I'm going to do sans underscore serif. So that's a custom font stack. That's me building one. I'm not necessarily sure whether I have Franklin Gothic Medium installed on my machine. It does not matter. It's going to add that as the first option there. So I'm going to go ahead and do a save all, switch back to design view, and now I notice my headlines here change to that sans serif font. So that's exactly what I wanted. Now we have our items displaying in exactly the font we want, while giving ample options for users who might not have that exact font installed on their machine. Notice how easy Dreamweaver makes this process by giving us multiple default family declarations and giving us an easy way to create our own font stacks. Now, I just want to pass on a little bit of additional information here. If you're looking for some good online resources, the site codestyle.org has a great article on building better font stacks, where they list commonly installed fonts on systems and list a few examples of font stacks that go really well together. So I definitely advise reading more about that. The other thing that I want to mention is that there are other options for using fonts that you want. CSS 3, which is the newest specification of CSS, contains a property called @font_family. That allows you to point to a font that is hosted on a server online so that it doesn't have to be installed on the client machine. There have been some various murky legal issues surrounding that, and one of the things that's starting to come out is that we're seeing a brand new service online where companies are hosting fonts for you to use for a small fee that you can use within your site. So if you're interested in a different approach, I would definitely advise you to read up on @FontFace so you can learn what it can do for you within your CSS. Embracing a web standards-based approach to web design means designing your pages to give as much control to the user as you can while maintaining the integrity of your original design. Remember, your users might be using different browser agents, handheld devices, or they may have accessibility issues that require the default font size to be set a little higher than normal. Without a doubt, one of the challenges in web design is anticipating how your users will be accessing your site. By using relative units of measurement when sizing text, you control how elements relate to each other relative to size, but leave the ultimate control of the text size to the user or the user agent. This helps your site become more accessible and more readable across a wider array of devices. We'll accomplish this in our Explore California site by first sizing the body tag to a baseline size for our site, and then using ems to size our text relative to the value sent into the page from the body tag. Since the font size property of parent elements is inherited by the elements inside of it, we should be able to control the sizing of our fonts with relatively few styles. So here I have the resources.htm open. Now, this is interesting. If I click inside my headline here, Got Questions, and I bring up my code navigator, remember that's Alt-click or Command-Option-click on the Mac. If I start at the very first rule and just sort of work my way up, I notice something. Nowhere along this list is anything said about font sizing. Interesting. Let's try our paragraph. Same thing. I'm not getting any font sizing. Okay, so if we're not getting any font sizing, why are they different sizes? Why is the headline bigger than the paragraph, for example? Well, that's because every single user agent out there has its own default style sheet. So headings already have sort of a default style sheet within a browser. Paragraphs already have a default size within a browser. And that's what you're going to get if you don't explicitly set a sizing for your fonts within your page. So you need to be aware of that as well. Okay, let's go over to our CSS Styles panel. And what I'm going to do is collapse my Files panel just to give myself a little bit more room. And I can change these dividing lines so that I can see more of one area versus the other if you'd like. Make sure you're in the All Styles area and select the body tag. We're going to go ahead and add a property here, and you can do that simply by clicking that link. I find this to be the easiest and fastest way to edit your style sheets. So I'm going to click right in there, and I'm going to type in font, so just the shorthand notation font. I'm going to hit tab. That's going to take me over to the other side, and we have to do this in a specific order here. I'm going to type in 100% space Georgia, comma, and then in quotation marks, times New Roman. You know, make sure those are all capitalized, the T, the N, and the R. Another quotation mark, comma, capital T times, comma, serif, lowercase, and then just hit return. So as you can see, I really like to hand code. I just like to type stuff in. You certainly could have double-clicked the body selector, typed 100% here, and grabbed Georgia times New Roman times and serif from the pull-down menu. That would have worked just as well. Okay, so a few things changed here. Did you notice how the paragraphs seem to get a little larger in relation to the headlines? So what we're doing now is we're basically telling Inner User Agent, hey, whatever your default size is, that's what we want for all of our elements inside the page. So make the paragraphs the size that you would normally make them. Make the headings the size you would normally make them. Well, that's fine, but now we can take a more granular level of control over these elements, and we're going to focus first on our headlines. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over to my CSS Styles panel, scroll down until we find Main Content, Main Article, H1. So that's the selector you're looking for. Main Content, Main Article, H1. That's going to target this little guy right there. So I'm going to click on that to highlight it, and I'm going to add a property here. And here we're going to add font dash size. So font size. Hit tab to move over to the values pane. And here we're just going to type in 2M. And you can just, if you want, you can just type in the number 2 and then follow directly by an EM. You don't have to grab it from the unit of measurement pull-down menu to the right of it. When I hit return, it's going to resize our headings. You might not notice any huge changes right now. All right, well, if I scroll down the page, here are my H2s. Just underneath the selector that we just set, we will find the main content, main article, H2. Go ahead and highlight that. We're going to add font size to that as well, so font dash size. Yes, you can grab that from the pull-down menu if you don't feel like typing that in. And then I'm going to do 1.6 ems, hit return. And it got a little larger. I mean, I don't know if you can see that, but it got a little bit bigger. And then finally, I'm going to find that pound main content, main article H3, add a property to it, and change its font size to 1.3 ems. And it definitely got a little bigger there. Perfect. Now, what about our paragraphs? Well, I would like our paragraphs to be the normal size of a paragraph within that user agent. Now, I could go ahead and set that explicitly to, say, 1M or even 100%. But truth be told, because I told my body tag to be 100%, that's going to be inherited by everybody, and that tells my paragraphs, hey, just go ahead and be your default size. In that instance, we really don't need to set any type of sizing for the paragraph at all. So what we did on the body tag has saved us a little bit of time. Okay, now if we were to preview this in a browser, and I think we'll go ahead and do that, so I'm just going to do Save All, preview in our browser. All of our headlines and paragraphs are relating to each other based on that sizing information. Now, you know that we can increase or decrease the size of the text within our browser. As a matter of fact, for Firefox, if we go into the zoom, notice that we have Control plus and Control minus, and we can even set it to only zoom the text. I'm going to do that. I'm just going to say, okay, I just want you to zoom text only. Now, if I do a Control plus or a Command plus on the Mac, you'll notice my text goes up or goes down. But do you notice how the sizing remains relative? They have the same relation to each other even as they're larger or smaller. And that's because of the fact that we're using those relative units of measurement. Now, you don't need to preview that within your browser. In CS5, we can now actually preview this directly within Dreamweaver. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go back into Dreamweaver, and I'm going to right-click my document toolbar. There's a little toolbar called the Style Rendering toolbar. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. This has gotten a little beefier in CS5. You'll notice on the PC, I'm moving this around, but you can't move this around on the Mac. Okay, so what does this toolbar allow us to do? Well, the first section in the toolbar allows us to turn on specific media styles. So if you wanted to look at your print style sheets, which we don't have any, but if you had some defined, you would click on that and you would see those instead of your screen media type. We also have a very quick way right here to toggle your styles on and off. So just clicking that will disable them. Clicking on them again will turn them back on again so that you can preview them. We also have pseudo selectors like link, visit, hover, and active. Very useful if you have links that have different selectors based on whether somebody is hovering over them. And we'll be doing that a little bit later on. And then we have this selection. And I want you guys to pay close attention to this. This is new as well. I like this. We can increase the text size or decrease the text size directly here in Dreamweaver. So if you really want to see what this is going to look like when somebody increases the text size or decreases the text size, you can just sort of click these buttons until you get what you're looking for, which is really cool. Now, this doesn't work with live view turned on. So if you turn live view on, this is all going to be disabled. This needs to work within the context of your regular design view. Now, you're also going to notice there's a little button right in the middle here that says Reset Text Size. So let's say you've increased it and decreased it a little bit and you can't remember what the size actually is supposed to look like. You can just click that and say Reset Text Size, and it'll take you back to where you're supposed to be. If it's grayed out, that should mean that your font sizing is at 100%, but I've noticed that to be a little buggy here and there, so sometimes it'll appear grayed out, sometimes it won't, but just click that and it'll reset your text right back to 100%. Now, one more thing. While we have used the resources.html page to help us format our font sizes, we know that because we're using an external style sheet, that our styles are now being used throughout the site. If we've planned properly and structured our pages well, the rest of our site should use these rules without us having to do any modifications. So there you have it. Our site's font sizing is well defined. It draws its initial value from the user's default font size, and then any scaling is done in relation to that value. You wouldn't think that you'd have to put too much thought into making text bold or italic. In reality, there are several ways to control text weight and style, and how you choose to do it depends largely upon your individual site strategy. From a pure HTML standpoint, you can use the emphasis and strong tags to render text as italic and bold, respectively. You should keep in mind, however, that these tags carry a logical meaning to them. Both tags are part of a group of elements referred to as phrase elements. An M tag represents text being emphasized and is usually rendered as italicized text, whereas the strong tag represents text that is more strongly emphasized than text contained within an M tag. So using these tags should be done within the larger context of your structural markup. So what do you do if you want to bold or italicize text without using structural markup? CSS allows you to take advantage of two properties, font weight for bolding and font style for italicizing. Let's examine the approach of using each of these techniques. Now, by default, all of your headlines, your heading 1s, your heading 2s, those are going to be bold. But if I scroll down a little bit, I find some heading 2s down here, and I really don't want those to be bold for this layout. I think that it makes them a little strong there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to modify our main content, main article H2 rule so that the font weight is told not to be bold. All right. So what I'm going to do is go over to my CSS styles panel. I'm going to scroll down through my styles until I find my main content, main article H2. I'm just going to double click that to open it up in my CSS rule definition dialog box. And here I'm going to change font weight from no declaration to normal. Now, if you don't declare a font weight or font style or really any value, what you're basically saying to the user agent is whatever you would normally do, just do that. Well, headings are normally bold, so leaving that blank is just going to make all of our headings bold. By choosing normal, click OK, we can see that that takes our headlines and says, okay, for that particular heading, don't make it bold. Now, we discussed structural bolding and italicizing just a minute ago. If I scroll down into the customer notifications area, notice that we have a couple of areas that we want to sort of stand out here. Now, I could highlight tour confirmation, and then down in my properties inspector, I could click either the bold or italic tag to do those, but I have to pay close attention to which tab I have selected. Currently, I'm looking at my CSS properties. If I do that, it's going to modify a CSS rule. If I want to add structural content, I'll go to the HTML properties and click the bold tag there. That, as you can see right here in the tag selector, added a strong tag. I want to do the same thing to the reminder notification and the sentence, if you do not receive a confirmation within 24 hours, contact us immediately. We'll go ahead and italicize that. That's going to add an M tag. So while visually we get a bold and italics, what we've really done is we've added structural markup that has logical meaning. So other user agents are going to be sort of able to infer that from us that this text is emphasized, this text is strongly emphasized. But what if you just want to make a visual change? You don't really want to add any structural markup to your code or any structural markup that can be interpreted. Take the company name here, Explore California. What if everywhere we find the company name, maybe we would want it bold and a blue color, okay? Well, number one, the M tag or the strong tag wouldn't do that for us, but maybe also we didn't really want to pass on any type of meaning to user agent. We just wanted to do something visual. Well, in this case, we could create a class and then encase this in a span tag. That doesn't necessarily pass along any structural meaning or any inferred meaning, but it does give us a chance to do that visual styling. So I'm going to highlight the text Explore California, and down in my Properties Inspector, I'm going to click on my CSS properties. I'm going to make sure that it says Targeted Rule is New CSS Rule, and I'm going to click Edit Rule. That's another way to create a brand new CSS rule. That's the exact same process as if we had gone over to the CSS Styles panel and clicked on the new CSS rule there. So we're going to do a class. Notice that comes up automatically here. And we're just going to call it dot, remember the period's very important, company. So dot company, there we go. We're going to define it in our main.css and click OK. Now for color, we're going to use pound 193742. So 193742. If you hit tab, it'll show you that sort of a dark, sort of teal blue, a common accent color throughout our site. Now, what about font weight? Well, let's go ahead and make it bold, but if you grab that pull-down menu, you may have noticed earlier, there are a lot of choices there. I thought it was just bold and normal. What's going on? Well, using CSS, you can go from the lightest possible value, which is 100, to the heaviest possible value, which is 900. Now, truth be told, most user agents cannot show the amount of subtlety between, say, 700 and 800. You'll never notice the difference. And the way it really sort of plays out is 400 is more normal, 900 is bold, and 100 is light if that is available. So we're just going to go ahead and say bold. We're going to click OK. And now we can see that we have a span tag surrounding that text. Right down here in the tag selector, it's showing us that. And our text is now blue and bold. Pretty cool. Now I could just scroll down through our text, find more instances of Explore California, and I could use my Properties Inspector now to apply company everywhere I find that. Now notice you can do that in both the CSS and the HTML properties. So if I switch to HTML and highlighted Explore California, I find class association right here. I could grab that and choose company, and I get the same results. Cool. Now let's do one more thing. If I look over here in the sidebar, I want all of our paragraph text over here, day spa package and the price, I want that to be italicized. Again, that's something that CSS can help us with. It really wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have to highlight every single one of those lines and surround them with an M tag. This is a purely visual style that we want to do, so we can go ahead and modify one of the existing rules. So I'm going to, again, come over to my CSS Styles panel, and I'm going to scroll through that until I start finding my sidebar styles. They're down a little ways. And I'm going to find pound sidebar, pound specials, space P. That's the one I want. I'm going to go ahead and double-click that again. And when we're dealing with italics, we're dealing with the property font style. So font weight for bolding, font style for italics. If I grab the pull-down menu, notice we have normal, italic, and oblique. Now, what's the difference between italic and oblique? Now, italic will actually use the italic version of the font. Oblique will sort of skew the font a little bit and is useful if that font doesn't actually have an italicized version of it. I recommend using italic instead of oblique because there are some times when oblique just does not look good at all. So we're going to choose italic, click OK. Now we notice that all those guys format as italicized text. So there we go. You know, having options, that's a good thing. When stylizing text, keep your options in mind and make sure that the solution that you use is going to fit your overall site strategy. Don't use structural markup unless the situation calls for it. And make sure that your styles are written so that the proper weight and style is passed on based on the rendering intent. As a designer, one of the things that I absolutely love about CSS is the amount of control that it gives me over my typography. Prior to using CSS, there were aspects of my type that I had no control over, like line height, for example. Now, whether you refer to it as line spacing, line height, or leading, the line height CSS property lets you adjust the amount of space between lines of text. While that, in and of itself, is great, if you have a full understanding of how the line height property works, you can make it do a great deal of work for you inside your layouts. The value that you assign to an element's line height becomes the distance between the baselines of lines of text. Now, what's more, the calculated value is one of the values used in calculating the height of an element's inline box, which allows us to do some pretty cool things outside of just controlling typography, as we're going to see in this example. So here we have the explorers.htm open, and I want to scroll down and talk about a few of the things that we're going to do here. Scrolling down and looking at our paragraph text, it is a little too jammed together. I want to space that out a little bit more so it's a little bit easier to read. If I scroll down a little bit further, I can see that I have a box down here where I have some of the benefits of being an Explorer member listed. What I'd like to do is kind of center this text, Explorer member benefits. I'd like to center that within that space vertically. Now, most people would use padding to do that, but as we're going to see, line height can help us do that as well. Well, let's first tackle the line height of our paragraph right up here. Remember, one of the easiest ways to target this is just to go ahead, hold down the Alt key on the PC, the Command Option key on the Mac, and click on it. And you can go right to the selector that you're looking for. Now, we're looking for the pound main content space P selector. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Now, it does open you up in split screen view, but more importantly, look at that. It jumps right over here to the CSS styles panel to that rule. I'm going to double click that to open that up in my CSS rule definition dialog box. Okay, well, here is where we get to set a line height. Notice that we do have units of measurement for that. We have a unit of measurement that we don't have anywhere else, and I want to talk about that. So I'm going to type in 1.8. Now, just a little plug for online typography here, guys. Online typography typically needs a little bit more white space than traditional print typography. So whereas your letting values in print might be set to, say, 120% of your text size, online, you should think of more of that as 140% of your font size. However, that's not a hard and a fast rule. In this case, we're going to do more. So when we do 1.8, if I grab the pull-down menu, we have all of our normal units of measurement. There's percentages, there's ems, there's pixels, there's whatever you want to use. But at the very bottom, we have a unit of measurement called multiple. Now, that's not going to be available in any other property, only line height. So what is multiple? Well, essentially, multiple means 1.8 times the size of your font. So if our font's at 1 em, which can translate to, say, 16 pixels, then it's going to be 1.8 times 16 pixels, or whatever the size of your font is. So you could also think of that as 180%, and you could certainly type in 180% and get something very similar. Most people for line height use multiples for one very important reason, and that's inheritance. Let's say we put a line height of 1.5 ems on our body tag. Now, the line height value inherits, so you would think that everybody in your site would get 1.5 ems as their line height. That's not entirely true. What would happen is the value would be calculated first. So you'd have 1.5 times whatever the size of the body text is, and then that fixed value would then be inherited by all of your paragraphs and headlines and things like that. That's not desired. However, if you use a multiple, then the multiple itself is inherited. So everybody would get that 1.5 or 1.2 or 1.8 or whatever it is that you're going for. So as a general rule, if you're really using it simply for sizing and you want to make sure the proper value is inherited down the line, use multiples instead. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK, click on Design View, and sure enough, now we get a little bit more vertical spacing between our text. That certainly does look a lot better to me. Okay, well, I'm going to scroll down a little bit further to our Explorer Member Benefits box. And remember, I want to center that text in that box, that sort of dark blue background that we've got going on there. Now, most people, when they first start trying to tackle something like that, typically will use padding to do this. They'll put the same amount of padding at top and the same amount of padding in the bottom and to get what they want. However, there's a much easier way to do this. Every single line of text that you use is inside of something that we call an inline box. Let me demonstrate that for you really quickly. You guys don't have to do this along with me. This is just me wanting to show you guys this concept maybe a little bit more clearly. All right, so if I take this and I give this a background color of, say, yellow, FF0, there we go, and I go back over to my page. Now, every single one of these lines of text is considered to be inside what we call an inline box. So this isn't one solid big block. Each one of these lines of text is in their own box. Now, line height is actually the space between the top and the bottom area between this box, and the text is centered in the middle of it. So 1.8 we're getting 1.8 times the size of this text, and then the text is centered inside that. So the distance from baseline to baseline is actually centered within that. Now, we're going to use that particular fact to our advantage in this Explore Member Benefits. So what we're going to do here is target, and once again, I can just bring up the code navigator. I'm going to target this rule, pound main content, main article, member benefits, H2. So by selecting that, I just bring that right over here. I'm going to double click that, and now we're going to go into our line height. Now, here we could do a relative unit of measurement, or we could do a fixed unit of measurement, because we're not really worried about inheriting this anywhere. We're more worried about the size of our actual text box. So if I give it a line height of, say, 2, and give it a multiple there, or click OK, and I'm just going to go ahead and flip that back over. You can see over here in Design View, we get a much taller structure. Of course, I can't be that precise with that, because if somebody increases or decreases the size of the text, that's going to increase or decrease with it. That may be the desired result, but what if you just wanted to make it, say, 40 pixels tall and have it stay 40 pixels tall? Well, you can do that as well. So I'm going to go back and edit that again. And this time, instead of leaving the line height as 2, and I'm just going to hand code this. You can bring up that dialog box again if you'd like. I'm just going to type in 40 px for pixels. Do a save all. Flip back over to Design View. You can see it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And that's based off of the default size. It's going to be about the same. But now, if I increase or decrease the size of my text, so let me increase that, you can see that the size of the box is actually increasing because the line breaks, but if I decrease the size of my text, the line box itself stays exactly the same size at 40 pixels. If I'd used a relative unit there, say 2 or 1.8, that would continue to resize even if the text shrunk down a little bit. So it's really a personal preference, and it's up to you whether you want to use a fixed unit of measurement for the line height in those instances or a relative unit of measurement. So line height, that's a pretty straightforward concept, but just like anything else with CSS, you must fully understand how it works in order to take full advantage of it. Using relative units allow you to create line spacing that relates to the text size, allowing the line spacing to scale with the text if the font size changes. Now, keep in mind that using multiples for line spacing is encouraged if the line height property is going to be inherited. Although not a good idea for the majority of your site's typography, using absolute values for line height both centers text vertically inside its line box, while also setting the height of the box itself, which is ideal for menus and other single-use structures. When controlling typography and layout, one of the biggest challenges is in dealing with vertical spacing. Block-level elements like paragraphs, headings, and lists are spaced vertically by using margins. On the surface, that sounds pretty straightforward and simple. However, there are two things that typically trip people up when attempting to control spacing through margins. First, vertical margins collapse. If you set a bottom margin on an element and a top margin on the element below it, instead of getting space equal to the two margins, you get spacing equal to the highest value. At first, this seems pretty counterintuitive until you realize that without margin collapse, all paragraphs, headings, and other elements would be double spaced. Now, the other small little detail is that every browser has its own default style sheet, with its own preset values for vertical margins between elements. Without compensating for or even eliminating these default values, your spacing can be hard to predict and inconsistent. We'll control our vertical margins by first reviewing how we eliminate any default margins that browsers might have, and then by setting margins that take into account vertical margin collapse. So here I have the very longly named tour detail big sur underscore trails.htm. One of the toughest things to do is sort of get rid of the default margins and padding that come inherent within a browser. There are a lot of different opinions about doing this, and if you want to read more about this, go out to Google and do a search for CSS reset. That's what this technique is typically referred to. There are any number of blogs, pages out there where people are talking about the pros and cons of CSS resets. Some people do these really detailed ones, some people don't do them at all, and some people do sort of a small flavor of one. Essentially what they're designed to do is this. They're designed to allow you to have control over the vertical spacing of your element, because if you leave the browser's default margins in there, chances are that margin might overwrite yours or might be larger than the one that you call for, and you don't achieve your desired spacing. The downside of this is if you zero out all the default margins for a browser, that means that you have to manually put them back in for every single element. And sometimes you could forget to do that, and you end up with really weird looking spacing. So what we're doing in our file is what I like to call a limited CSS reset. That means that only a few of the elements that we're going to be using throughout our site are reset, and they're really just the ones that we're going to use over and over and over again. Well, let's take a look at our reset. I'm going to go right over here to our tour detail Big Sur Trails.html document, and I'm going to click on the main.css link. That's going to take me to my main style sheet, and notice that it opened it up in split view. I'm going to scroll down, and at about line number 48, we can see our limited CSS reset. We're doing all of our headings, our paragraphs, an address tag, block quote, those are both common block level elements, div tag, the unordered list, and list item. Notice that we didn't do an ordered list. Maybe we're not using a lot of those. The key here is that we're only doing select elements. It's a much shorter list. We don't have to remember to do it for every single element. We just have to remember to do it for all of our headings, our paragraphs, if we're using addresses or block quotes, any div tag that we want, which, by the way, that's kind of a just to be safe because most div tags don't have a default margin in browsers, and then unordered list and list items. Since those now have zero padding and zero margins, we're going to have to explicitly set those in our styles. I'm going to switch back over to design view, and we can see the result of that CSS reset. You can see these headlines: Backpack Cow, Big Sur Retreat, Hiking Trail Information. All those guys are right on top of each other. Now, these paragraphs have some spacing, but that is due to line height, not vertical margins. And you might also say, well, wait a second. I see some vertical spacing between this paragraph and this heading. Well, that's true, but that's being caused by this graphic. It has a float applied to it, which moves it to the right, and then this heading has a clear property applied to it, which says, no, I have to go below you. So that's why we're seeing the spacing there. You can see our lack of spacing returns again between this heading and this paragraph, that paragraph and that list, and all of those list items. So those are elements that if we want to control their spacing, we need to put those vertical margin values in there manually, and that is our next task. Now, what we're going to do first is target our main article heading right there, Backpack Cow. Now, you can do this through the CSS Styles panel. You can hand code it, whatever you'd like to do. I'm going to scroll through here until I find main content, pound main article, H1. Now, I'm going to collapse my files panel by double-clicking the tab there. It's going to give me a little bit more room here and here, and it's going to make it easier for us to find these selectors. So highlight the pound main content, main article, H1. And I'm going to add a property to this. I want to add a margin dash bottom. So we can target just the margin on the bottom of our elements by saying margin dash bottom. You could also grab the pull down menu, and you can see you have values for overall margin, bottom margin, left, right, and top margin as well. All right, so for the margin bottom here, we want to set a value of 0.4 ems. When we hit return, we can see that now we get some additional vertical spacing between Backpack Cow and Big Sur Retreat. So we've adequately spaced that out for what we're looking for. Now, remember, 1 em would be 100% of the size of that heading. 0.4 means not quite as far down as the size of the heading. Okay, let's keep going. I'm going to go down to the next selector, which is pound main content, main article H2. That's going to target our heading 2s. I'm going to add a property here. Here we want to add the margin top, so margin dash top of 1.2 ems, and I want to add the margin dash bottom of 1 em. Okay, so what in the world was I just doing there? Well, the 1.2 em basically says I want more space above me than below me. And that's going to give a nice visual separation to let folks know that you're starting a new section or a new subheading. So we increase the space that we see here. Now, that's not cumulative. We didn't do 1.2 plus 0.4 ems. In actuality, we're only getting 1.2 ems there because of that collapsing vertical margin. Now, remember, hiking trail information is still inside that heading 2. That's all one heading 2. We're using a span tag to move that down to the line below it. So the 1 em bottom margin is occurring between this paragraph and between that heading. Now, speaking of this little span right here, it can have its own margin if you'd like. We need a little bit of space between this text and the span tag. So I'm going to go right down to the next selector, which is pound main content, main article, H2 span dot tour cost. I know that seems really long, but it's just descriptive of where that is. Now here I'm going to add a property to this, and I'm going to add a margin dash top. So I want to give a little bit of spacing between the Big Sur retreat text and the hiking trail information. So margin top is going to allow me to do that. And I'm just going to do a margin top of 0.25 em, so a quarter of the available font size. You can see that gives us a little bit of spacing, but still keeps them together as a unit. Let's keep going. Let's go down to pound main content, main article H3. And here I'm going to add a property to that. I'm going to add margin. Now, here's something interesting. I want to do some shorthand notation so you guys can see that. If you need more than just top or bottom, right, left, that sort of thing, it's a little bit tiring to always have to go margin top and then margin bottom. Well, you can do shorthand notation. So instead of saying margin top, margin bottom, margin right, margin left, you can just say margin. And then you can pass along any values that you want. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to type in margin, hit tab to go over to the value section of that. And then I'm going to type in 1.25 em, then a space, and the space is very important, then a 0, then another space, and then do 0.5 em and hit return. Now, what does that mean? Let's talk about this for a moment. In the margin value, you can pass one value, two values, in our case, 3 values, or 4 values. Let's talk about what those would do for you. If you pass a single value, that's a margin all the way around the element. So you're looking at top, right, bottom, and left being all the same value. If you have 2 values, the first 2 values represent the top and the bottom. The second of the 2 values represents the right and the left. Well, what if you do 3 values like we've done here? The first value, 1.25 em, is the top margin. The middle value here represents the right and the left. And finally, the 0.5 ems is the bottom margin. Well, what if you have 4 all the way around? Well, just imagine a clock. You do top margin first, then right, then bottom, and then left. Some people remember that through the mnemonic device Trouble, TRBL, top, right, bottom, left, but I just remember the hands of a clock, so it works for me. So essentially what we've done, and I'm going to scroll down and find our heading 3s. Here we go. Notice that we've added more space above the heading 3 than below it. And again, that gives us a nice separation between the section above it and then the section below it. Now, finally, for our main body text, let's choose our paragraph, so main article P. I'm going to add a property to that as well. Margin dash bottom of 1 em. And that's going to control the spacing below the paragraph. Now, you might have noticed that while it affected the spacing between the paragraph and the list, it didn't affect the spacing between the paragraph and the heading. Again, the reason for that is margin collapse. This value of the heading top is actually higher than the value of the margin bottom for the paragraph. Because of that, the higher value wins. They don't add up. It's not cumulative. And we're left with the same spacing we had before. That's a really neat technique because you can ensure that paragraphs have a default spacing below them, but then any subheading that comes along, you could add a little bit extra margin above it and give yourself that separation within your text. Okay, we're almost done. The last thing we have to do are these list items. Those guys are all jammed together, so we're going to give those a little bit of extra spacing as well. So I'm going to scroll down until I find pound main content, main article, LI. Once I find that, I'm going to go ahead and add another property here. And the property I'm going to add here is margin. Once again, we're just going to do margins all the way around. So remember that 4 values I talked about? The top value is going to be 0, and then do a space. Right value is going to be 0, and then add a space. So no top margin, no right margin. But for bottom margin, we're going to do 1.2 ems, and then another space. And for left margin, and what this is going to do is it's going to indent our entire list for us so that it's a little bit more like a list. We're going to do 2.4 ems. And when I hit return, there's our list. We're getting 1.2 ems worth of space between them. And then right here, we're getting 2.4 ems of space, which is sort of pushing that list over and indenting that. Sweet. So now our typography looks a little better. If I switch over to live view, I can see a more fully rendered version of that. And we have some spacing that's making that a little bit easier to read. Now, making sure that your elements are spaced properly is fairly easy to achieve by using vertical margins. Just make sure you account for both browser default margin values, which we did earlier on by zeroing those guys out, and margin collapse when planning your styles. If you do that, you should be able to achieve consistent element spacing throughout your site. Most of the time, if I need to control spacing in my typography, I use margins. However, there are times that padding is required to achieve the desired result. While margins control the space between elements, padding handles the spacing within the element. Each element is contained within its own box. Increasing the padding increases the distance from the contents of an element to its edge. Keep in mind that this can also increase the total width and height of elements, and that needs to be factored in when determining the relationship of surrounding elements. In this movie, we'll use padding to achieve nicer spacing for our tour resource links, then control the amount of inset that our frequently asked questions answers have, and we'll also modify the relationship between a headline and its border. So I have the FAQ.htm opened up, and let's just scroll down so we can see the elements that we're going to be affecting. So here we have a couple of links that will jump us down the page to our frequently asked questions. They're inside these list items, and you can see they have a background color and a border applied to them. So to give that a little bit more spacing, open them up a little bit, make them look a little bit better, we're going to use padding to help us with that. The answer portions of our frequently asked questions really need to be sort of offset a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to inset those so that they have a little bit of space over here on the right-hand side, and that's going to give us a nice little visual separation between the answers and the questions themselves. And then finally, monthly specials has a border applied to the bottom of it, but the border and the text are almost touching, so we're going to use padding to open that up a little bit more so that we get a higher degree of space between there. So let's start with our links up top. Now what I'm going to do is just go ahead and use my code navigator. So remember, I can Alt-click that on the PC, Option-Command-click on the Mac, and there are a lot of rules here. The one that we're looking for is this one, pound main content, pound main article, ul.faqnav space li. So that's targeting any list item inside of an unordered list with the class FAQ-nav, inside the main article, inside the main content. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And once again, if you want to be able to see this while you're doing this, you can just sort of move that divider so that you're seeing less code, more design. But I'm really using that to find it over here in my CSS styles dialog box. I'm going to go ahead and double click that rule to open that up in my CSS rule definition dialog box. Now remember, you want to look right up here to make sure you got the right rule. li ul.faqnav main article, main content. Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my box category. You can see we're controlling padding and margins through our box properties. I'm going to deselect same for all. I'm going to do a top padding of 0.5 EMs. I'm going to do a right padding of 0.5 EMs, a bottom padding of 0.5 EMs, and finally a left padding of 1 M. There we go. So top, right, bottom, all of 0.5 Ms, and then a left padding of 1 M. When I click OK, I can see I have an increased amount of spacing all the way around, and these links are now getting a lot more attention visually on our page. Let's scroll down and take a look at our frequently asked questions answer portion of it. And if I click inside of that, I can see that this is part of a definition list. So I have a DL there, and we're going to be targeting that DD tag. So once again, I'm just going to go ahead and Alt-click or Option-Command-click on that. I'm going to bring up my code navigator, and I want to find the pound main content, main article, dl.faq.dd. When I select that, I can go right over to my CSS styles panel, double-click the one that's highlighted. It's a very fast and easy way to find your targeted rule within all those styles. And I'm going to click on the box category. Again, I'm going to deselect, same for all for padding. And I'm going to do 0 padding for the top, 0 padding for the right, and 0 padding for the bottom, because all we're really wanting to do is move this over a little bit to the left. Now, if I wanted to, I could have left all that blank. I could have just left top, right, and bottom with no values and given it a left value. For left value, we're going to give it a padding of 2 EM with no spacing. Now, you could also write that this way. You could say 2, and then you could grab the pull-down menu and choose M's. I just find that to be a little faster. When I click OK, click back into my file and design view, and we can see now we have a little indentation for each of those guys, and this is a nice separation between the answer and the question itself. Now let's take a look, finally, at our headline right here, monthly specials. If I Alt or Option Command click that, what I'm looking for here is this callout H1 selector. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And again, I can just come right over to the CSS styles panel and double click that. It's going to open up my CSS rule definition dialog box. I can go right down to the box category and set some padding. Now here, I just need padding on the bottom. So I'm going to deselect same for all. And on the bottom, I'm going to do a padding of 0.25 M, so 0.25 EM. And I'm not even going to set those other ones. I'm just going to click OK. And if I click back in here, you can see now we've added a little bit of spacing between that headline and a little bit of spacing between this headline and its border as well. By using padding, we can control the space between an element's content and the edge of an element. This is particularly useful when dealing with elements that have background colors, just like our links right up here, or background graphics, or when we need to control elements that have borders. I will discuss margins and padding in more detail later in the chapter on layouts, since they're also used heavily in controlling CSS-based layouts. Although aligning text with CSS gives you more choices than HTML, it is still a fairly basic procedure. To align text, you use the text align property and have the option of choosing left, center, right, or justify as your value. Alignment is inherited, so if you align the parent element, all elements inside of it should have the same alignment. If you don't specify a text align property, most user agents use left align as the default, so not specifying it is often the same as choosing left align. We'll also take a moment to explore vertical alignment. Although vertically aligning text is somewhat best handled using padding or line height, there is a vertical align property that does more to confuse people than anything else. So as we align our text, we'll also explore that property, hopefully to clarify what that value can do for you. So here we have our frequently asked question file, faq.htm, and that is open from the 0708 resources folder. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of alignment to our sidebars. Now currently, our day spa package and the price, 2-day salt and sea and the price, big Sur retreat and the price are all left aligned. We want those right aligned so that they're lining up with the name of the tour. Now we notice that those are all paragraphs and they're all in the div tag with an ID of specials. So we're going to use that to our advantage in targeting this. Now, just to prepare this a little bit, I'm going to go over to my files panel, double click the tab. That's going to collapse it. It's going to give us a little bit more space over here so that as we're targeting those rules, we can see them and modify them a little bit easier. So I'm going to go right over to my day spa package. I'm going to click in there and hold my Option Command on the Mac, Alt key on the PC, click that, and I'm going to target that very bottom rule, pound sidebar, pound specials.p. I'm going to click on that, and that's going to jump me down in my CSS styles to that rule. So it's an easy way of finding that. And I can see the existing properties. Now we're just going to add some properties here and modify the existing rule. So instead of double clicking it to open up the CSS dialog box, we'll just make a very quick little edit right here. So I'm going to add a property and I'm going to add the text-align property. That is the property that we use when we're setting text alignment. Now, if you hit tab, it'll move you over and you could type in the value if you want, but you get a nice little pull down menu here and take a look at our values here. We have left, right, center, justify, and inherit. Now, the only one that might be a little confusing to you there is probably inherit. What you're doing there is you're basically saying, hey, go up to your parent element, whatever that may be, whether it's a div tag or the body tag or whatever, find out what its text alignment is and go ahead and inherit that. Now, text alignment does inherit, so typically you don't have to specifically tell it that. Now, for what we're doing here, we want to choose right align. So when we click back into our design view, we can see that we get our nice right alignment for all of our paragraphs, so that worked out perfectly. All right, well, what about these headings? They look okay left aligned, but I'd kind of like to see what they look like center aligned. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to use my code navigator, so that's Alt-click or Option-Command-click. Go find the last rule here, call out H1, that's the one we're targeting. And then right over here in our CSS styles, highlight that, go right down here in our properties, and I'm going to add the text align and hit tab and then choose center from that. And now when we click back in design view, we see all of our headings in our sidebar there are centered, and it doesn't look that bad. I think I'll keep it. Now, one last thing here until we get to vertical alignment are these answers. They have a ragged left edge, which isn't too bad, but I'm kind of wondering what they would look like justified. So again, I'm going to use my code navigator to target the main content, main article, dl.faqdd rule. Select that. And then I'm going to go ahead and add the text align property to that, just like we've been doing. But this time, the text align property that I want to add is justify. So I want to do text align justify. This time, when I click back into design view, we can see that all of our frequently asked question answers are justified alignment, and that looks pretty cool. So we're going to leave it like that. All right, now let's talk about vertical alignment for a moment. I'm going to do a save all. And I'm going to scroll down. And one of my questions is, can I use your backpack? Notice the answer is no, bring your own. We will provide all the H2O you can drink. Well, in this case, I'd like the 2 to be subscript rather than being aligned with the rest of it, just like the formula H2O. Now, we do have a subscript and a superscript tag. That's SUP and SUB. The problem with that is we can't really control how far down or how far up the characters go. It's totally up to the user agent. So a lot of people would rather use a property known as vertical align. So as we write a custom class selector for this, we're going to take a look at the vertical align property and talk about some of its limitations. So highlight the letter 2. And with that highlighted, come down to your properties inspector. Make sure you're on the CSS tab. Make sure your targeted rule is a new CSS rule, and click Edit Rule to create a brand new class based on what you have selected. So here, my selector type needs to read class, and we're just going to go ahead and call this .subscript. There we go. I'm going to click OK, and in our CSS rule definition dialog box, you'll find the text align properties in the block category. So here's all the text aligns we've been doing, left, right, center, and justify. We're wanting to take a look at vertical align. Now, when you grab that pull-down menu, it looks like, man, you've got just a tremendous amount of options here. Align to the baseline, subscript, superscript, top, text top, middle, bottom, text bottom. That's a lot of choices. Well, in reality, this property is designed more for table cells than anything else. So text top, middle, bottom, those are applying to table cells. So if you ever apply that to a line of text inside of a div tag and you're like, why isn't it centered within the div tag vertically? That's why. That is not the best way to do that. However, notice that we do have a sub and we do have a super. Well, let's do the sub and see what it does for us. So I'm going to choose sub. I'm going to click apply, and let's see if we can see any changes here. Let's see, OK. And now we've got a span that says subscript. Well, no change there, but if I turn live view on and render that using the WebKit rendering engine, you can see that the 2 is positioned down below that line. Whew, that's a little far, don't you think? So that sub value didn't really allow me to control it by any numeric value. It just went ahead and subscripted it down, and maybe that's not what I was looking for. So I'm going to go back to my CSS styles panel. I'm going to find my subscript selector, which is right there. Now, it's wherever you last were selected in your CSS styles panel. Remember, you can always find that by clicking on your code navigator and finding it that way. So you may need to select that, bring up the code navigator and find it, but you should be able to find it right over here in your CSS styles panel. Again, I'm going to double click that, go to my block category, and now instead of vertical align saying sub, I'm going to take that to -0.2 EM. So you can actually use any explicit value you want. Positive values will move you above the baseline. Negative values are going to move you below the baseline. So now when I click OK, I get this little warning about how, hey, that's not valid, but it really is. It just wasn't valid for older versions of CSS, the CSS1 specification. So if I do a save all and make sure live view is still turned on, you can see that's a little bit more manageable. It's not shoving it all the way down to where it looks like it's on a separate line. And you could play around with that value and get that exactly where that you want. Now, aligning text is fairly easy, but remember to account for inheritance when aligning text. It can lead to more efficient style application. If you tell a parent tag to left align, there's no reason to tell anything inside of it to left align as well. Keep in mind also that the vertical align property only applies to inline elements. So in this case, that one letter or a span tag or something of that nature. It's not going to apply to a block level element. To vertically align block level elements, you'll have to use margins, padding, line height, or a combination of those techniques. The level of control that CSS allows you to have over your text is pretty remarkable. And in this movie, we're going to talk about transforming text. That is, forcing the text to conform to capitalization rules for your site, regardless of how the original text was typed. This is particularly valuable in situations where you can't control the text input, say when the text is coming from a database or when text is being updated by a third party. If you need the name of a product to always be capitalized, for example, the text transform property allows you to specify that. In addition to examining the text transform property, we'll also take a look at the font variant property, which allows you to choose stylized capitalization like small caps. So here I've opened our faq.htm file again, and this is found in the 0709 resources folder. Now I'm just going to scroll down a little bit and talk about what it is that we're going to be doing. Down here, all of our tour names really should be capitalized, and currently they're not. There's a wide variety of capitalization going on there, so we need to fix that. And if I scroll down, I can see that at the bottom of each section, there's a link that returns people to the top of the page. Sometimes it's capitalized, sometimes it's not. It doesn't seem to be very consistent. Frankly, I would like for them to be all lowercase, so I'm going to use text transform to do that for me. And then finally, at the very bottom of the page in our footer, we have our company name right there. And frankly, I would like a more stylized treatment of that, so I might want to see what that looks like in small caps so I can see if I wanted to treat it that way throughout my entire site. So let's scroll back up and tackle those one at a time. Let's go ahead and tackle these guys first. So again, I'm going to target a rule by using my code navigator. I'm going to hold down the Alt key, that's Command Option on the Mac, click on that rule, and the one that we're looking for is not all the way at the bottom. This time, it's pound main content, pound main article, ul.faqnav space li. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And again, remember, I can use the CSS styles panel, or I could hand code it if I wanted to. I will double click the files panel to give myself a little bit more room. And I'm going to make sure that that is indeed the selector that I have selected. There we go. So I'm going to go down and add a property to that. And I'm going to add the text-transform property. So text-transform. If you're worried about spelling that and the dash and all that, remember, you can grab that through the pull-down menu, text transform. Now let's take a look at the options that text transform gives us. We have capitalize, which is going to make sure that each word is capitalized. We have uppercase, which is going to make it all caps. We have lowercase, which is going to make sure it's all lowercase. We also have none, which basically means leave it alone. And we have inherent that basically says, hey, what's the parent object doing? Let's do that. Well, we're going to choose capitalize. And so when we click back into design view, we can see that each of our tour packages is now capitalized regardless of whether it was before or not. So that's really allowing me to cover my bases on that. Now I'm going to scroll down a little bit, find one of these links, return to top. Now if I target that with my code navigator, what I'm looking for is this selector right here, pound main content, main article, PA period top. So that is any A tag, which is an anchor, which is the link tag, with the class top applied to it, found inside of a paragraph, found inside of main article, found inside of main content. I know those can get a little long. So I'm just going to click on that. And with that targeted and highlighted, this time let's double click that so you can see where text transform is in the CSS rule definition dialog box. Well, here it is right here, text transform. I'm going to grab that pull down menu, and this time I'm going to say lowercase, click OK. And now when I click in design view, I can see that each of those is now all lowercase. Perfect, exactly what I wanted. Now let's scroll all the way down and take a closer look at Explore California. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and bring up my code navigator for that. The very bottom rule, footer, footer body, footer right column, heading 1, that's the one we want. And I'm just going to double click that as well because I want to show you where this is in the CSS rule definition dialog box if you're ever creating a rule and you want to use font variant. Right above text transform is font variant. If I grab that pull down menu, notice I have two options here, normal and small caps. Now normal is the default, so unless you're trying to overwrite something that's been done earlier, you're probably only going to use this if you ever just want small caps. So I'm going to choose small caps, click OK, and click back into my design environment. Now, Dreamweaver doesn't do the best job of previewing what small caps are going to look like. So what I want to do is do a save all, click back on design view, and I'm going to click live view to render this page with the WebKit rendering engine. If I scroll down to my footer now, I can see that that actually looks a little bit better. You might also want to preview that in another browser, say Firefox, for example. And now when I scroll down, all the way down to the footer, I can see my small caps there. I kind of like the way that looks, so I think I'm going to leave it like that. All right, excellent. Now all the tour names, return links, and the footer text is displaying following our site's specifications, regardless of how the text was entered. Whether you use the text transform and font variant properties to ensure proper text display, or to create stylized displays that vary from the actual content, you'll find these properties an indispensable technique in controlling your site's CSS. Our final movie in this chapter will focus on putting a little bit of everything we've covered so far together, while focusing on the concept of using the cascade to control styling. When creating the CSS for your sites, your focus should be on writing the cleanest and most efficient styles possible. By utilizing the cascade, you can write generic styles that handle the bulk of your styling work, leaving you to write just a few very specific selectors when styling in one area varies from the global standards that you've set. This method requires that you spend a good bit of time planning a site-wide strategy for typography for your site. To be honest, that's a really good idea. It helps your site be more consistent, requires less code to achieve the desired results, and saves development time since you won't be constantly overwriting and rewriting your styles. Now, we've got open an unstyled page here. Yes, it has some layout. Yes, it's got some graphics in it, but the typography of this page is totally unstyled at the moment. So the first thing that we're going to do, and that's what we'll do in this movie, is to create our global styles. And then in the next movie, we'll follow that with just a few area-specific styles that are required to finish up our desired formatting. So what we have open is the resources.htm, and this is found in the 0710 folder. Now, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to switch this to a split screen view. I want my code on the left, and I want my design on the right. Just to give us a little bit more screen real estate, I'm going to take our panels, and I'm going to collapse those panels down. So I can do that in the upper right-hand corner of the dock. I can collapse those to icons, and then I can grab the separator and just sort of push them a little further over so I only have icons over there. Now, why am I doing all that? Because we are going to do a little bit of hand coding in this movie. Now, don't panic. It's not that hard. You've had a lot of experience so far in this chapter by using the CSS Styles panel. You've had a lot of experience. Go ahead and opening up the CSS Rules Definition dialog box and entering in values there. So now it's time to do a little bit of hand coding. I promise we'll go slow. We'll get through it. It's going to be okay. And I guarantee you, you're going to think to yourself after you're done with this, hey, that's not so bad. All right, so what I need to do is up here underneath the name of the file, resources, I need to click on my main CSS so I have that open. So we're looking at our CSS on the left-hand side, we're looking at our design on the right-hand side, and we'll be able to kind of focus back and forth between the two in order to do what it is that we need to do. So the first thing we need to do, I'm going to scroll down, is around line 55. I'm going to place my cursor right there, and I'm going to do our limited scale reset. Now remember, earlier we took a look at this, and that's basically zeroing out all the margins and the paddings so that instead of the default margins and paddings that the browser might give our elements, we're in charge of writing those. So it sort of resets everything so that we're in control of it. So the first line I'm going to type in H1, comma, H2. Now I want to talk about that comma for just a moment. Spaces between selectors mean that you're looking for one selector inside of another one, but the commas are a way of grouping selectors together. So that comma is a way of saying both the H1 and the H2. All right, so we're going to do another comma. We're going to do H3, comma, H4, comma, H5, sense of pattern, comma, H6. There we go. Comma, P, comma, address, comma, block quote, comma, div, comma, UL, comma, LI. And if it breaks on you, don't worry, it's okay. All right, so we're good there. Now I'm going to open up a curly brace. Now, where do I find those? Well, on your keyboard, just to the right of the P key, you have your opening and your closing curly braces, and you have to hold down the Shift key to get them. So I want an opening curly brace. Now, as soon as you do that, Dreamweaver is trying to help you out. It's giving you a full list of properties that you can set for this particular selector that we've just created. I'm going to hit return so that we go down to the next line, just in keeping with the formatting options that they've already been doing. Here, I'm going to type in M. It'll jump down to margin, and that's exactly what I want. So this is a process called code hinting, and it helps you rapidly write code. By just hitting M, I jump down this list of margin, and now when I hit return, Dreamweaver finishes it for me. It not only finishes typing it, but notice that it typed in a colon for me as well, so it's helping me with the syntax too, which is really cool. Now I'm going to type in 0 and then a semicolon. Semicolons are used to say, okay, this property is over. Let's move on to the next one. Go down to the next line, and here you want to type in padding, or actually you can just type in P. It's going to jump down to padding. You can hit return, and once again I can type in 0 and a semicolon. Here's the tricky part of handwriting CSS. Usually, where people get themselves in trouble, they just sort of forget to do something. In this case, we've opened up our curly brace, but we haven't closed it yet. So right after padding, I'm going to hit return, and then I'm going to close my curly brace. There we go. So every single CSS selector and rule needs to have that opening and closing curly brace. Don't forget those. Okay, so if I save my file, I can just do a save all. And if I click over in design view, everything sort of shifts and gets closer together. So that's us sort of removing all that default spacing. So there we go. Now remember, we're writing our global styles here. We're not targeting any one specific area. we're writing the styles that are going to pertain to the entire site globally. So we're going to be writing a lot of element selectors, a lot of really basic selectors that are going to be driving the look and feel of our site. So I'm going to go down just a little bit further in my code, and just below my scale reset that we just did, on a blank line there, I'm going to type in P. That is an element selector that targets the paragraph tag. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell our browsers what we want our paragraphs to look like. Again, I'm going to open my curly brace and hit return. And now I'm going to start styling my paragraph. The first thing I want to do is change the color of my paragraphs. The default color is black. I want something a little bit different. So I'm going to type in CO, and it jumps right down to color. So sometimes you have to type almost the whole word. Sometimes a single letter will do it. But I'm going to get right down to color and hit return. And now I'm going to type in pound 333. Notice that even here in code view, the color picker comes up. And if we wanted to, we could have gone right there to find pound 333 and select it from the swatch panel that comes up. So now I'm going to type in a semicolon, hit return to go down to the next line. And here I'm going to do line height. I'm letting code hinting finish a lot of this stuff for me. So line dash height 1.8. Now, you'll notice that I'm going to type in a semicolon and not pick any unit of measurement. No percentages here, no M's. Now, the reason for that is because for line heights, we're using a multiple, and multiples don't require any type of unit of measurement after it. Remember, the only property that we can do that with is line height. I'm going to go down to the next line, and here I'm going to type in margin dash bottom. So margin dash B, and you should be able to just hit return and let Dreamweaver finish that for you. Margin dash bottom 1M, semicolon. Once again, don't forget to close your curly brace. And when you see the rule below you turn magenta again, you know you've done the right thing. And now if I click over in design view, you can see that our paragraphs are formatting. They got their line spacing, they get the color we want, looking pretty good. Okay, we have a few links to write. And this time you're going to be exposed to something that you haven't seen before, and that is what we call a pseudo selector. Now, CSS can respond to user interaction. So when somebody hovers over a link, when they click on that link, if it's an active link, you can actually style different settings based on that. And that's how a lot of people create rollover effects based on their links. And that's how we're going to do that. So right underneath your paragraph rule, I want you to type in a colon, so no space here, just a and a colon, and then the word link. Then comma, a colon visited. Now, what are we doing there? Well, we're making sure that our active links and our visited links look exactly the same. Normally with a link, if you click on it and you go back to that page again, instead of an underlined blue text, you see sort of that purple text indicating that you've been there before. Well, for our site, we don't want to show anything visually different for visited links, so we're just going to group those two together. Once again, I'm going to open our curly brace, hit return to go down to the next line, and now we need to go ahead and style these. We're going to change their color, so I'm going to type in color, and here I'm going to type in pound, so give me a little hash mark here, 952, which is an orange color. I'm going to hit return to go down to the next line, and here I'm going to type in text dash decoration none. As soon as you're done with that, you can hit return and close your curly brace. So those are the only two properties we're setting there. So what is text decoration none? Well, watch my links over here, right here, once I click on design view. You notice what goes away? So that underline that you have under your links is going to go away if you tell it text decoration none. Now, most people just assume that I do that because I hate the underline. I don't really. I mean, underlined text lets your users know, hey, click on me, I'm a link. But there are other things that you can do to let people know. In this case, the color is significantly different from the surrounding text. So it does kind of lead the user to say, hey, I can probably click on that. We can reinforce that concept by changing the styling if somebody hovers over that link, and let's do that now. Now, I'm going to click back into code view right after the last selector I just wrote. I'm going to hit return, and here I'm going to do a colon hover, comma, a colon active. So just like our link and visited, hover and active are going to look the same as well. What's an active link? Well, that's one that you're currently clicking on or that you've focused on. So I'm going to open up my curly brace, hit return, and here we're not going to do a whole lot. I'm going to change the color. So I'm going to do color, and here I'm going to do pound CB 7D20. It's a lighter orange. So CB 7D20. And a semicolon, go down to the next line. And I'm going to add an underline, but I'm not going to do it through text decoration. I'm going to do it through my border property, which gives me a little bit more control over this. So I'm going to type in border dash bottom, border dash bottom. And here we can do some shorthand notation. We can tell it 1 pixel, and then a space, dashed for a dashed line instead of a solid line, and then another space, and then we need to give it the color. So here we're going to do pound CB 7D20. Little semicolon there. Close your curly brace. And now we can't see that right now unless we turn on live view. So I'm going to turn on live view. And now when I hover over one of the links, I can see that underlined text and the little dashed line. We get enough of a color change to make a slight difference, but it's nice and subtle. Okay, I'm going to turn live view off again. And let's finish up by doing our headings. So I'm going to scroll down in our code a little bit, just underneath all of our accents and things like that, to about line 79. And then I'm going to create an empty line here that I can create my first heading. So here I'm going to do H1, so a big global element selector. Open up your curly brace, and after that I'm going to choose font size, so font dash size of 2 M's. Hit return, and I'm going to do color, pound 193742. So again, 193742. Type in a semicolon, and then one last little thing, we're going to increase the spacing. We're going to do margin dash bottom of 0.4 M's. Again, I'm going to close my curly brace on the next line, and I can see the styling changed here. We get a little bit more space between that margin and the paragraph. Color changes, the font size changes a little bit. There we go. Let's continue on with our headings. Now we're going to do an H2 heading. Open up our curly brace, and here we're going to do font size, so font dash size, 1.6 EM. Notice there's no space between the unit of measurement and the type of measurement, so you want to keep that consistent. Do a semicolon there. For color, we are going to do pound 51341A. So pound 51341A. Now you might be wondering, how does he remember all these colors? I don't have them memorized. I have them written down and I'm reading them off a sheet. But I'm going to show you guys a way to maybe make those a little bit easier to remember here in just a moment. Let's go down to the next line. And here I'm going to type in font dash weight normal. So remember, that's going to remove the bold off of that heading, and it's going to make it a little bit more normal. And then I'm going to do a margin property, and I'm going to do a top margin of 1.2 M's, and then a space, 0 for right and left, and then another space. And then for my bottom margin, I'm going to do 1 M. So we're doing some shorthand notation there, just to make that a little bit easier to write. And if I click in Design View, maybe scroll down a little bit, I should be able to see a heading 2, and I can see it format. So that's looking pretty good. 2 more selectors to write, guys. I hope your hands aren't cramping on you. We're moving right along. We're going to do H3, open up a curly brace, and below that we're going to do font dash size, 1.3 M's, semicolon. For color, we're again going to do pound 51341A. Again, we're going to do font weight normal, so font dash weight normal. And then after that, we're going to do a margin of 1.25 M's for the top margin, 0 for right and left, and this time 0.5 M's for bottom. So that's a little different. And then I'm going to click, and we can see our styling. So you might have noticed that, hey, H2 and H3 was very similar. They're using the same color, same font weight, margin's almost the same, and font size is almost the same. What if they were both exactly the same? Well, if they were exactly the same, we could have grouped them together the same way we did our CSS reset. However, I am going to show you a grouped selector here that's going to allow us to do something else. We're using floats throughout our layout. Now, we cover floats in the chapter on layout a little bit later on, but what floats really do is they move objects to the left or to the right of an object. Well, we don't want that to ever happen to one of our headings. We always want our headings to be on their own line and not have anything aligned to the left or to the right of them. It sort of allows them to stand apart, if you will. So we do have a property called clear that allows us to do just that. So I'm going to go down on the next line, and I'm going to write a selector that says H1, comma, H2, comma, H3. So it's grouping all of those main headings, H1, H2, and H3 together. I'm going to open up my curly brace, and then I'm going to type in clear both. That says don't allow anything to float to my left, don't allow anything to float to my right, and again, make sure that you have your opening and your closing curly braces. You probably won't notice a change if you click into the design view because we don't really have anything like that going on this page. Now, I promised that I would show you one of the tricks I use for making sure I remember what colors I'm using. If I go all the way up to the top of my style sheet, notice that right up top, I have a color guide. So here I tell which colors I'm going to be using for the site, what colors those are, and often I'll just copy and paste those colors wherever I need them. So it's a quick and handy way to do that. So our global styles are now fairly complete. Now the page's typography is not finished, but the global styles that we have written have completed much of the work for us. Now, more importantly, they're going to provide the foundation for the entire site's typography for every single page. In our next movie, we're going to expand on these global styles by writing targeted styles for specific regions. In our previous movie, we wrote our site's global styles. Global styles give you the baseline styling for your site and provide the foundation for the remainder of your site's styles to be built off of. In this movie, we're going to tackle the next step in styling your site's typography, writing targeted styles for specific regions of the page. Now, very rarely will you want all paragraphs in the heading, sidebars, footers, and main content regions to look the same. To accomplish this, we're going to use descendant selectors to target specific elements within page regions. It will help for us to review the structure of our site and talk about how this is going to allow us to style each area separately. So I'm going to do that now. I have our resources.html file open, and this is found in the 0711 folder. So if I go over to code view, we can see that inside of our wrapper, we have a header. So we have a header region. Then we have a region called main nav. After the main nav region, we have a region called main content. Inside main content, we have another div tag called main article. After our main content region is finished, we have another div with an ID of sidebar. So we have a sidebar region. And finally, we have a region with the ID of footer. So if we're looking at that in design view, we have the header, we have our main content, which is that region, we have our main navigation, which is that region, we have our sidebar, which is this region, and finally, we have our footer, which is that region. So we have those distinct areas, and we can use those areas to target specific styling for the content inside of them. Now, in the last movie, I made you hand code. I'm sorry, but I hope you enjoyed it and noticed that it really isn't that hard. Trust me, if you're really adverse to code, forcing yourself to do that a few times would really make you feel like, it's really not that bad. But I'm going to let you off easy this time. We're going to go back to the CSS styles panel, and we're going to use that to make the majority of our changes. Okay, so let's just go down through our page in order and start targeting those areas that our global styles didn't fully style. The first thing I want to turn my attention to is right up at the top of the page, resources. Now, this is a heading 1 that has an ID of page ID. Every single page in our site has this. We have a little heading at the very top that identifies which page that is. That's especially helpful when we have something like resources where there are multiple files in the resources section. It really helps identify that this is indeed that section of the site. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to write a selector that targets this. So I'm going to go over to the CSS styles panel. Again, I'm going to collapse the files panel just to make this a little bit easier for me. And I'm going to use the CSS styles panel to help me focus exactly where I want this to be placed. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come right over here and find this pound main content H1 tagline rule. I'm going to click that to highlight it. Now, why am I doing that? Because now when I create a new rule, the new rule is going to go directly underneath that one. So it's a really easy way of making sure that your styles remain organized as you create new ones. Okay, I'm going to create a new CSS rule. And here, I want to create the main content space page ID. Now, that came up automatically. How in the world did Dreamweaver know to do that? Well, remember, I was clicked inside that heading when I chose new CSS rule. Dreamweaver is going to try to write a selector for you that targets that region. Now, it doesn't always get it right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my cursor in front of the pound page ID, and I'm going to type in H1. So now what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, any heading 1 with an ID of page ID, and notice there's no space between H1 and page ID, that's found within main content I want to affect. Now here, you need to make sure that there's a space between the H1 and main content. So if you don't have a space there, make sure there's one there. Okay, I'm going to click OK. Now, one of the first things I could do here is set the color for this, but remember, we wrote our global styles where all heading 1s had that sort of deep teal color. That's the color I want, so I don't need to set it again here. Now, for font size, I'm going to choose 1.4 em, so I am going to change that. I want my font weight to remain bold, so I'm going to be very explicit about that. And then I'm going to go and set some box model properties. So I'm going to go to my box category. For margin top, I'm going to do 20 pixels. Now you'll notice here I'm not doing ems, I'm doing pixels. That's because I want to make sure it stays exactly that far away from the top edge of the page. Ems would change if somebody changed the font size, whereas 20 pixels will always remain the same. And for padding, I'm going to turn off same for all. For bottom, I'm going to type in 0.25 EM. There we go. Now, one last little thing here. I want a border underneath it to act as sort of a rule between it and the content below it. So I'm going to go to my border category, deselect same for all, and then we're going to do a bottom border. I'm going to do a solid border, 2 pixels, and for color, I'm going to do the same color, pound 193742. If I hit tab, I can make sure it's that teal color that I'm looking for. It is. And then I'm going to click OK. So just like that, our header up top styles itself exactly the way we want. And again, we use the region and the ID that it has to target that specific element. Now I'm going to scroll down a little bit because I want to style this list that we have down here. It doesn't look like a list right now, but if I click inside of it, I can indeed see that it is inside of a UL tag and that each of these guys are inside list item tags. Remember, in our global styles, we did a reset that told all unordered lists and list items to have no margins and no padding. So it pretty much just made it look like not a list. All right, so let's go ahead and make it look more like a list. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit more in my styles and find this main article UL selector right there. I'm going to select that because I want my next rule to go just below that. So I'm going to choose a new CSS rule. And my compound selector is coming up pretty much the way that I want it, except for a couple of things here. Number one, I don't need this pound wrapper at the beginning, so I'm just going to choose less specific, and it'll get rid of that. Even though it's not hurting anything, I don't really need the UL there either, so I'm going to get rid of the UL, but I'm going to be very careful to make sure there's still some spacing between main article and LI. To be honest with you, once you get used to writing these descendant selectors, it's easier a lot of times just to write them yourself rather than trying to go through this sometimes complex dialog box that Dreamweaver has. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And here I'm going to switch immediately to my box category because margins and paddings are what we're going to use here to control this. So for margins, I'm going to choose deselect same for all. My top margin is going to be 0. My right margin is going to be 0. My bottom margin, on the other hand, that's going to be 1.2 ems. And then finally, the left margin is going to be 2.4 ems, and that's going to push it away from the edge of the parent container by a good amount there. I'm going to go back to my type category, and in my type category, I'm going to change font size to 1em, and then for color, I'm going to go ahead and choose pound 51341A, and that's that sort of brown color that we were using elsewhere in the site. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now our list is looking a little bit more like a list. Now, you might notice that we don't have any bullet points. That's okay. We're going to go in and set those bullet points as graphics a little bit later on. Okay, so that's our main content region. Let's turn our attention to our sidebar, which right now is not looking that good. So we need to go ahead and fix that. I'm going to scroll down through my styles, and eventually I'm going to find one of the sidebar styles right there. Well, I'm actually going to click on the main content rule just above it because I'm going to write a very generic sidebar rule, and I want that to be the first of all my sidebar rules. So again, I'm just going to highlight that and then click the plus symbol. And now this time I could just do an ID selector really because I'm just going to do pound sidebar. Make sure it's defining it in main.css and go ahead and click OK. Now here we're going to write really what amounts to a global style. Everything in our sidebar should be a little smaller than the rest of our content, just by the very nature of the sidebar being so narrow. So for my sidebar's font size, I'm going to type in 90%. That's going to shrink down any text inside of a sidebar to 90% of what it would have been originally. It's just going to make the text in the sidebar a little bit smaller. When I click OK, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. It took all your headlines, all your paragraphs, shrunk them down just a little bit. That also means that if I now say 1em for one of those, they're actually going to be 1em of 90% of what the body tag would be. So those values are cumulative as you go down the order, and that's something you really need to remember. Okay, let's target some of those specific areas. So once again, with that rule selected, I'm going to choose New CSS Rule. I'm going to do a compound selector, and remember when I said it was just easier to type these yourself sometimes? This is one of those times. I'm going to type in pound sidebar space P. So pound sidebar space P. So any paragraph inside of a sidebar. Click OK. And for that, we just need a line height. I'm going to do a line height of 1.2. Make sure I'm doing multiples there. And that just means a smaller line height than the remainder of our page. I'll go ahead and click that, and it does tend to move things up a little bit, although we've got so much going on there right now, you can't really see that change. Okay, now, I want to affect these specials. Notice that this is still rather crowded in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the fact that this is a div tag with an ID of specials inside sidebar. I'm going to write a rule that targets that element specifically and targets the H2 inside of it first. So again, I'm going to come right over to my CSS styles panel, click on new CSS rule, and I'm going to type in pound sidebar, pound specials, space H2. So pound sidebar space, pound specials, space, and H2. Now remember, this is targeting any heading 2, found inside of an element with an ID of specials, found inside of an element with an ID of sidebar. So please don't get overwhelmed with these really long selectors. All they really are is saying, hey, when you find this inside of this, go ahead and style it that way. We make those increasingly more specific so that they don't really work or overwrite any of the other styles we have on our page. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now we've got a little bit of work ahead of us here. Our font size is going to be 1M, so we've got that. Our font family is going to be Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. Our font weight is going to be bold. It's going to ensure that that heading is bold, no matter what else is going on around it. For color, I'm going to go ahead and click inside that dialog box, and I'm going to type in pound 193742. Remember, that's that teal color we've been using. And again, if you ever want to see what this is doing, just click apply, and you can see all of our headings right there changing. Now, there are a couple of things we still need to do here. I'm going to click on the block category, and for text align, I'm going to choose right. I'm also going to click on my box properties, and I'm going to deselect same for all for margin. For my bottom margin, I'm going to type in 0. I'm also going to click on padding, same for all. And for padding top, I'm going to type in 1EM. So 1M for padding on the top. Now, why did I do a little bit of top padding? Because we're going to do a border that's going to separate all of those elements. So I'm going to go to my border category, deselect same for all. And for border top, we're going to do solid, 1 pixel, and we're going to do that same color, pound 193742. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and now you can see exactly what's going on there. That border up top is acting as a nice separator between those guys, and the text is aligned. Well, we've got a little bit of work to do, and you might say to yourself, you know what? I don't like that top one having that line. I would rather have my monthly specials and not have that separator between them. Well, if you click inside that heading, you can see that there's actually a class already applied to it called top. And that's going to allow us to tell that one, hey, by the way, top one, you shouldn't have a border. So let's go ahead and write that selector while we're at it. So I'm going to go right over to my CSS styles, new CSS rule. And here, we're just going to select compound selector, type in pound sidebar, space, pound specials, space, h2.top. Now I'm going to click OK, go down to border, and I'm just going to tell border none. And that's all we really need to do. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and you can see that border is going to go away for the top one, but still gives us a nice separator between the bottom two there. So that's cool. Now, believe it or not, I know this thing still looks kind of messy, but we really only have 2 more selectors to write. So let's go ahead and write those selectors for us. I'm going to go ahead and choose new CSS rule, and I want to target the paragraphs within that particular element. So I'm going to type in pound sidebar, space, pound specials, space, P. So pound sidebar, space, pound specials, space, P. So any paragraph inside of a div tag with an ID of specials, inside of the other div tag with an ID of sidebar. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And this one's going to be fairly easy. The font style is going to be italic. The text align is going to be right. So I'm going to go over to my block category. And for text align, I'm going to choose right. I'm going to go down to my box category and deselect same for all for margin. And for top margin, I'm going to type in 0.5 ems. And for bottom margin, I'm going to type in 0.5 ems. I'm going to leave the right and the left alone because I really don't want them to have one. So I could type in 0, or I could just kind of leave them alone like I'm doing. One more thing. Let's go back to our type category, and let's set a line height for that. I'm going to set the line height at 1.6. That's going to control the amount of space between one paragraph and the next. Remember, for line height, we're going to be using multiples. So now when I click OK, I get the spacing I want between those guys, and I get the alignment that I want. They're italicized. They're looking exactly the way I want them to do. Now, the last thing I need to do right here is our monthly specials. That headline, along with the Did You Know headline, really don't fit those regions. So right now they're getting all their styling information from the global H1, so we need to overwrite that. So we notice, by the way, that they're in a div tag with a class of callout. Because callouts can be used within our main content and within our sidebar, I want to write a selector that really isn't specific to the sidebar, and having that class callout is going to allow me to do that. I'm going to go to my CSS styles and scroll up and go all the way up and find this callout selector. Now that's controlling the div tag itself, but I want to target the headings inside of it. So with that selected, I'm going to choose new CSS rule, and I'm going to do a compound selector, and I'm going to do dot call capital O UT out. So call out with a capital O space H1. So again, that's going to target any H1 inside of an element with the class name callout. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then just make a few minor changes here. Font size is going to be 1.2M, so we're going to make it a little bit smaller. Color for that we can leave unchanged because that teal color is going to work out just fine for us. Let's go ahead and put a border on the bottom of it. So deselect same for all. We're going to do a bottom border, solid, 1 pixel. And the color for that is going to be that same teal color. So pound 193742. So after a while, you do kind of get them memorized. And you know what? Let's make that a little bit thicker. How about 2 pixels? That'll offset it a little bit from that line underneath it. So, feel free to make changes as you're doing this. And you're like, well, what if we did this? Or what if we used something other than a solid line? What if I used a double line? Yeah, feel free to go ahead and do that. Kind of experiment with it and see if you can get something that you like a little bit better. Now I'm going to go to the box category. And here I'm going to deselect same for all for both margin and padding. For my margin bottom, I'm going to type in 0.5 ems. It's going to add a little bit of space below it. But for my padding on the bottom, I'm going to do 0.25 ems. And that's going to push the border away from the text a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and apply that. Click OK. And there are our headlines. Cool. So I'm going to save the file. We've done a lot of work here. Preview that in my browser. And now we see the result of our global styles and our targeted styles coming together to format that page the way that we want it to be formatted. Cool. Now, writing our global styles first and then focusing on specific areas, that's a really good practice. And it's one that's going to ensure that your styling is consistent throughout your site. It also means that when you're writing styles for specific areas, you don't need to define the same properties over and over and over again. If all headings are going to be Arial, for example, you don't need to define the font family property in every heading style, just a global one. Even better, your typography is now much easier to update and maintain because most of your edits will be made to the global styles, not the area-specific styles, which can be harder to locate and more numerous. Now, in the end, each designer develops a strategy that fits their site and their workflow the best. As you develop your own styles, pay attention to the techniques that can save you time, create smaller code, and still give you the power and flexibility that you require for your design.